Dear colleagues, today is day 173 of heroic fight of Ukraine for its freedom. My name is Natalia, and we continue the series of briefs in Mediacentr Ukraine. Our today's guest is Geoffrey Nice, a British barrister, prosecutor at the trial of Slobodan Milošević, Serbia's former president, in the International Criminal Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia. Geoffrey, over to you. Can you please tell us what is the goal of your visit to Ukraine?
Well, thanks for allowing me to come here and talk to you. The purpose of my visit to Ukraine as part of the international IWPR, Institute of War and Peace Reporting, whom I've known for 25, 27 years, with whom I've worked before, is to help them where I can with whatever views I may have on accountability and how you deal with accountability for war crimes. Perhaps more important than that, to learn for myself what's going on, because occasionally I'm asked to commentate, and it's better to be well-informed rather than not so well-informed. And maybe to raise some issues for consideration by Ukraine. One's got to be so careful. It's absolutely not for me to give advice to anyone. I don't know enough. I'm not from Ukraine. I don't speak the language. So how can I give advice? So I certainly shan't be doing that. But I have some ideas from the various things I've experienced, which may feed into the general thinking about the terrible events that are going on here. You find yourselves in Ukraine in a quite remarkable position. You're the country most people who are interested in world affairs want to visit. You've got a president who, more than anybody else, most people in political life want to be seen shaking hands with. He's probably as popular as the Pope. And all this has come about as a result of terrible misfortune, worse, tragedy. And viewed from outside, you're in an extraordinary position because you are now sitting on top not just of moral high ground, but of moral peaks that others can't reach. And there are at least two of them, and maybe three. You've got the moral peak of having been prepared to fight. Remember, NATO was not prepared to fight. It would say it was not able to fight because of its fear of the consequences of mutually assured destruction, but it actually was not prepared to fight when arguably it should have done. So you sit there right on the top with moral authority. The next moral authority was in respect of war crimes, where you straight away looked at any criminality by your own side, something that is not done in most wars, was not done by the Allies in the Second World War. So you're sitting there on this moral peak. And then thirdly, in your leader, you've got somebody who did not walk away, who chose to stay and lead. And he has, whatever the background and to whatever other people's surprise, provided leadership of a type that others can now only aspire to, which is why, of course, our soon-to-be ex-Prime Minister spends so much of his time here. So those are my opening observations. I can go further, or perhaps you'd like to ask me some questions. I don't know how it works.
Geoffrey, хочу продовжити.
Geoffrey, as a follow-up. Can you hear me? ICTY lasted for 25 years. How long do you think Ukraine has to wait? Can you hear me now? Can you hear the interpretation? Can you hear the interpretation, Geoffrey?
Please repeat.
Okay.
Can you hear the interpretation? International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia lasted for 25 years. How long should Ukraine wait? Чує переклад.
Well, thank you very much. This is an extremely important question, and it goes to the very heart of problems with accountability for war crimes. And in many ways, the Yugoslav tribunal's long proceedings have been problematic and harmful, not least to the people of Bosnia. I need to explain that in a little more detail if you've got time. The first thing to remember is that when the Yugoslav tribunal was created, and the Rwanda one, they used the model of trial of the British system, the American system, the Australian system, for no good reason. There is no explanation for why they chose that system. That is inappropriate. It is not an inquiry into truth. It's a battle. It's trial by combat. And it takes a very long time. And so, no doubt for the best of reasons, even if we don't know what they are, the system started out with an inevitably slow process. The next thing that you may think was a serious error was to treat all potential defendants as being of the same importance, so that leaders and foot soldiers were treated the same way, and it all got messed up. No, in my view, that's not what should have happened. And everybody should recognize, who deals with accountability for war crimes, that there is a difference between the trial of leaders and leadership and the trials of the foot soldiers, the privates, the corporals, the sergeants, the captains, the majors, and so on. And in my view, when you ask the question, how long will the trials take, there should be a division, and you should make a firm decision to try the leadership and to try it as quickly as you possibly can. It's probably not a very difficult trial in many ways. And to separate that out from the huge political question of whether you're going to try everyone you possibly can over 20 or 25, 35, 45, so on years. That's a big political decision, which brings in a number of other considerations about the way human beings behave in conflict. And therefore, when you ask how long it will take, and I don't know exactly what you've got on the stocks and what you've got in preparation at the moment, but I would urge your country to consider making as its priority, by whatever means you like, trying the leadership and getting that done quickly. And here's two of the reasons why. First, the Nuremberg trials, which are criticized these days, the trials of the leadership lasted 1 year.
Якщо в когось є запитання залу, підніміть руку.
If anybody has a question, please raise your hand and we will offer you a mic. So get a mic and ask your question, please.
I would like to thank you so much for coming over to Ukraine in these tough and tiring times. My question is a brief one. Considering that the entire world has not seen a war like this since Iraq in 2003, where two major countries were, in battles, in air, on land, in any kind of conceivable space, what is your estimate to how lightly or harshly the world will judge the Russian Federation, considering its size and influence and the resources that they have, not to mention the many billionaires that reside in London right as we speak right now? Thank you.
A very big question and an extremely important one, how the world will judge the Russian Federation. Well, at the moment, if you clump together the West, and it's really the West and America, the present judgment is completely hostile to the Russian Federation. But we've got to recognize that the Americas have so far not really put themselves out to express an opinion. Similarly with the East, this side of China. So, although the evidence may be overwhelming as to what the judgment should be, the answer to your question at the moment remains uncertain. And that uncertainty is made stronger by the disturbing accounts we are already getting of weakness within the coalition by those countries who want to have their oil back on the cheap, their gas and oil. But if I go back to your question and slightly rephrase it or pick a bit out of it, I think you've got to allow for the possibility that this war, not only the most important or the most serious war in Europe since the Second World War, but may, in the eyes of historians, in decades or centuries to come, may, depending on the outcome, be seen as the most important war since the First World War. Because depending on the outcome of this war, other wars may be deterred, may be stopped. We've all got an eye to that, and we look to the East and to Xi Jinping in China and to Taiwan, but he's not alone. Thus far, despite all the documents that were prepared after World War II, we've been pretty inefficient at stopping people like Putin doing what they want to when they think they have sovereign power. Is this going to be the conflict at the end of which we discover we have found a way of deterring others from doing the same thing? And one last point before you ask the next question. One last point. Something that has been overlooked time and again is the importance of bringing the leader and his cohort to justice. We don't know, we can't know, what would have happened if the Kaiser at the end of World War I had not been allowed to go to Holland and die a natural death, but had been tried as the Versailles Treaty envisaged. Might that have had an effect on what Hitler and Goering, Ribbentrop and Himmler decided to do? You can always argue no, that they were so determined they would never be put off. And you can argue the same thing about Pol Pot, for example, or even Milošević, although that's rather small in comparison. But unless you have a process whereby it is a priority of the international community to bring leaders to justice, then you're doing nothing to stop the next one doing the similar or a similar or the same thing. So that's a longish answer to your focused question. Coming back to your question, it's all there for you to achieve what the world lands up thinking of Vladimir Putin. There's a huge responsibility that has been put on Ukraine's shoulders by the failure of NATO, and it is a failure, to be able to fight.
Geoffrey, please take here the other.
Like that?
Can you hear me now? What evidence the judges are going to take into account during the tribunal regarding the crimes of the Russian Federation against Ukraine?
I don't know which particular tribunal you have in mind. There may be several. There's, after all, the International Criminal Court. There's the International Court of Justice dealing with the Genocide Convention alleged breaches. And there's your own internal trial process. And who knows? You may, given your high moral peaks from which you cannot be disturbed at the moment, you may decide to do something totally different. And the world will not stand in your way if you do. They are in awe of you and in envy of your moral authority. So I don't know what particular resolution it will be. As to the evidence, there's stacks of it. There's been stacks of it from the beginning. And I find very unhelpful the commentary by international lawyers and others that it's going to be a long and slow process and it's very difficult. No, it isn't difficult. If you if you, a leader, have your soldiers bombing and destroying domestic buildings day after day, you are fixed with knowledge of that from when? At the very, very latest, day 2, because you, like the rest of the world, have a television set. And if you'd seen that happening, you would know it was a war crime, and you would have done something to say, sorry, that's not what we intended. Putin has never said that. Putin, by his silence and inactivity, knows full well that he is acting in breach of all known rules of war. And the evidence is quite straightforward. If you want to look at the evidence for genocide, that will be more difficult, or maybe more difficult. And it can be argued, and I would, that it's not as important as people might think. What's really important is to fix this Russian Federation leadership with the criminality that's been facing us all around the world, on the television, day after day.
Хто буде
Who will be number 1 on the list for the punishment? And the punishment should be severe, I believe.
I think I'm going to let everybody answer that question to themselves, because I think it's probably obvious.
Джефрі, тоді які
Can we draw parallel between Milošević and Putin? Can we compare them as war criminals? Is it even possible to compare them?
точніше саме
I suppose you could, but I think that Milošević and the Balkan Wars are going to pale into comparative insignificance compared with the gravity of what you're facing. But there is an absolutely critical lesson to learn from the Balkan Wars, and in particular from the Bosnian part of that war, where the Bosnian Muslims were kicked out of their homeland, and in order to kick them out, thousands of them were killed. Now, there is no one who can raise a remotely sensible argument for why that happened to them. There was no justification. It was without reason. But if you speak to if you speak to people born more recently, learning of all this over the last few years, they will be hearing versions that suggest some kind of moral equivalence between the Serbs of Bosnia and the Serbs of Serbia and the Muslims, and they won't know where it lies. The consequence of that for the Bosnian Muslims has been extreme, because uncertainty as to their being completely blameless and the Serbs being completely to blame means that the Bosnian Muslims, Bosnia itself, have found it very difficult to make progress. They haven't made progress. If you like, they are a stuck country with thousands of their young people leaving to live elsewhere every year. And I come back to the point I made earlier about the necessity of trying a leader or the leadership, and the point I made about the Nuremberg trials. And I'd like to make one last point about that before I finish this answer. If you have a clear resolution of who is in the right and who is in the wrong early, then the country that is in the right can move forward. If you have any uncertainty, then you're at risk of the same consequence happening to this country as has happened to the much, much smaller country of Bosnia, where 27 years after the worst events, every film is still about the war. Children can't be brought up not to think about the war. Every conversation is about the war. And let me just give you this example about the Nuremberg trials, and I don't know to what extent it's borne out by academics. I was born just after the Second World War, and I went to school there for about 7 years after the Second World War. Big school, 10 years, university, 19 years. We never talked about the war. Not with our mum and dad, not with my friends' mum and dad, not with my teachers, not at university. Why? Not because there was anything to hide, or because people had terrible experiences to suppress in the way that, of course, we now know the Holocaust survivors did. No, no, this is just ordinary people in war. My mum and dad didn't need to talk about it because it was over and we were moving forward. And for the Ukraine, I beg your pardon, Ukraine, it is critical that that lesson is learned, whether from the Second World War or from Bosnia. Make sure the culpability of the leadership is hammered home, and make sure that the Western community accepts it and does not soften it by saying, oh, well, maybe there's a reason why you should settle. No. You're blameless, stick to it.
Джефрі, наостанок.
And the last but not least question. How can journalists and how can Ukrainians get involved in gathering the evidence in order to expedite the process of ICC?
Everyone is expediting the process because everybody suddenly realized that their mobile phones, for example, can turn into evidence. And I'm sure that the journalists who are represented here today in the audience are doing that as well. I think there's also one other really important point to bear in mind, which annoys me about lawyers and judges. And it's this. If somebody says, this is my video of what happened in my town on a certain day of a certain month of a certain year, the basic position, the default position is you believe that person. You don't start doing the lawyer's trick of saying, well, maybe it's untrue. No. People don't talk of terrible events, making them up. Sometimes, very occasionally they do, and when they do, they usually give it away, and there's a reason to doubt them. No. Don't let lawyers earn money and spend time and waste time by bringing doubt into the narratives of people who produce evidence. Work on the basis that evidence produced by individuals, all of us, is likely to be true.
We have a question for you. My name is Olha Huzba. My question for you is the following. How do you see the role of media in reflecting war crimes and the transparency process in war crimes?
Critical, because the public have no other way of receiving information other than through the media, except occasionally when they get direct knowledge. I think the media's problem is, let me make a term up, audience fatigue, readership fatigue, viewer fatigue. And one of the problems is that the more you put on screen pictures of really terrible things, the more the ordinary viewer ceases to understand quite how serious it is. And so their attention declines, their shock declines, and therefore when it comes to electing politicians, and the politicians may make different decisions about whether to support Ukraine or not to support Ukraine, their view of the conflict becomes less important in the overall democratic process. It's a very difficult job for media because the man in the street, the non-specialist, yes, he's entitled to want to look after his family, do the garden, go on holiday, play sport. He doesn't have to spend all his time recognizing the gravity of the world, the gravity of the situation of the world in which he lives. And yet somehow journalists have got to move from just direct reportage to explaining quite how big the risk is. I dare say we've seen that with climate change. For years and years and years, the evidence was there. Media were reporting it. Attention ebbed and flowed, and suddenly, when we have a red-hot summer, we run out of water. Suddenly people realize it was as serious as people had been telling us 20 years ago. And the job of you media is the really difficult one of expanding to reportage, to grab the understanding and to shape the understanding of the audience as to gravity of the present situation. Remember, it's only this conflict that has brought the fear of nuclear conflict back into the public space. For many years after occasional near misses in 62 and 83 and others. We sort of forgot about it. But it's there. It's there at the end of the finger of a person with no sense of morality. It's there. And if you listen to the people who speak about the universe itself, not just ours, I mean all of them, I never know which way around it is, but the whole lot, the infinite, impossibly inconceivable lot, it is possible we are the only place where life like this has developed. It is possible that this is the only place where what is called reason has developed. We contemplate without having its arrest at the forefront of our minds. If we contemplate nuclear destruction, we contemplate the destruction, possibly, of reason itself.
Дякую, Джефрі.
Thank you, Geoffrey. So let me remind you that our guest today was Geoffrey Nice, a British barrister, prosecutor at the trial of Slobodan Milošević, Serbia's former president, in the International Criminal Tribunal for Former Yugoslavia. That's the end of our today's briefing. Thank you very much for being with us. Please follow our announcements on Mediacenter Ukraine. Stand with Ukraine, because we are one day